So one of the interesting things about Indonesian Islam is at one point, we could have said that Indonesia was the model for a pluralist, democratic, Muslim majority country. And my current state is, I hope it will remain that. I have colleagues who aren't so sure anymore. There has been a conservative turn. There has been, when the statement is a hotbed of terrorism, Indonesia's gotten better with its borders, but at one time, 17,000 islands. You can sneak people through custom and immigration fairly well. And when we say there's a hotbed of terrorism, we're actually talking about, for the most part, foreign terrorists, like supposedly the planning for the September 11th World Trade Center attacks took place in Indonesia, and all the actors were snuck into Indonesia. With 17,000 islands, it's kind of hard to secure the borders. It is Islamists, and I define that term simply to mean people who favor a Sharia state. It can be defined lots of ways. I define it very narrowly. Is only getting between 11 and 12, maybe as high as 13% of the national parliamentary vote. It gets up to 14% in some of the regional parliaments, but they also shape the discourse. So they do things like they've been successful in banning the sale of beer at like 7-Eleven and Circle K, which is actually causing 7-Eleven to go out of business and leave Indonesia. And the problem with that is really all that does is it keeps alcohol available for the rich and makes the poor drink poorly mixed stuff. It doesn't really keep people from drinking alcohol. It just makes the poor drink stuff that makes them go blind. So actually a lot of ulama friends of mine oppose this for precisely that reason. It's sort of like, the poor, if people will still drink, they're just going to drink dangerous stuff. And the rich still have access to all the good stuff. So this is a gross oversimplification, but in Indonesia there are two major Islamic organizations that together represent about 90% of all the Muslims. And the one is Nahdlatul Ulama, and it's coming. One major source stream there is Imam al-Ghazali, and lots of others. Again, I said gross oversimplification. Whereas Muhammadiyya, the modernists, are coming from Ibn Taymiyyah and the Wahhabi, more first, what might be called first or second wave Wahhabi, not the third wave Wahhabi. One of the funniest things is a friend of mine whose family practices like original Wahhabism, and her brother came back from Saudi Arabia wanting to sort of enforce modern Wahhabism, and she was so sad, and they're different. Her grandfather came back, her great-grandfather came back from the Middle East, and had studied under Wahhab, and so it's a different. The term madrasa, and you find here the term madrasa in Indonesia is a different. So pesantren or madrasa Islami, as you know, but the term madrasa in Indonesia means a different thing, and it means religious day schools. Also, for those of you who are not Indonesian, my Arabic is pronounced with a horrible Indonesian accent. And if you don't understand, we can sort of ask some of the Indonesians in the room to pronounce it closer to the Arabic, perhaps. So one of the major questions in educational debates for me is where do we get scientists, teachers, preachers, bureaucrats, and where as a society do we want to go? So in the pesantren education, at one point this was the only kind of education that people could get. I mean, one of the interesting things about Indonesian history is to understand that in all of the rebellions against the Dutch, they could be measured in days, 12 days, 18 days, except Diponegoro and his war. And Diponegoro was a prince who was educated in pesantren. And he was able to bring together the noble sort of aspect and the sort of religious aspect of the society together. And his war against the Dutch lasted 5 years. And after that point, the Dutch very purposely separated the noble classes from this kind of education. They couldn't go to these schools. They had to go to Dutch schools. So when Clifford Geertz talks about a non-religious nobility class versus an Orthodox Muslim merchant class, well, the Dutch made that. Purposefully created that situation. It wasn't just something that kind of naturally emerged. Some started adding, quote, secular education, and well, wait, is any knowledge really not of God? Right, you know, these debates take place. Like, we can't call it secular because is any religion not of God? I'm like, or any knowledge not of God? I'm like, okay, but for shorthand, we'll call it, you know, non-religious or secular education. And what happened in some places is that the traditional skills that ulama were expected to have declined because the days got very long. So either they didn't spend as much time on the religious education, or you'd have a day that would literally start at I'm going through English, Indonesian. So, but start with the morning prayers and end at like 10 o'clock at night. You know, to go and doing a full sort of 5 or 6 hour government curriculum school day, and then another 5 or 6 hours of traditional Quran recitation, and at the more advanced levels, reading, interpreting, translating, and debating the meaning of fiqh texts. And so some places, a lot of the more traditional skills were lost, and the conclusion was that we don't need everybody to be able to read medieval fiqh texts. We just need a few. But if we can have everyone have the morals of an ulama, or they call them their kiai, then that will be enough. But there's also a very strong, amongst the traditionalists, a very strong anti-radical bent. They're like, if you're reading, you know, they basically, if you're working within, and they were primarily, they'll say if you're working within madhab, any madhab, there's no chance of you becoming radicalized. But they're working from a perspective of really only knowing Shafi'i. And I'm afraid, because I'm an anthropologist, I only really know Shafi'i. So I can't tell you whether or not working within other madhab would or would not. But that's their take, and the importance of working with the traditional texts. It's part of the Byzantine education. It's part of also the Islamic higher education for continued research, the leadership. So one of the things that happened in the 1990s was a question of where leaders will come from. Because if Byzantine are no longer graduating religious leaders, because they're basically, they've added junior high and high school, and they're graduating religiously oriented, you know, bankers, but not ulama. Where do the ulama come from? And one of the answers was PhD programs, but in the 1990s, they were very dissatisfied with the state Islamic institute system. And the reason why, and most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the Islamic higher ed, but, and again, maybe part of the problem of being an anthropologist and being trained to look at everything is it's very hard for me to separate the debates that I saw going on in the early 2000s with the debates that I saw going on in the 1990s, that they seem to be that the solutions to issues about education at the junior high and high school level then led to things that had to be solved at the higher level. So these things have been called many different things through time. The Institute Agama Islam Negeri, or the State Islamic Institutes, or you've got the University of Islam Negeri, and the system is sometimes called the PTIEN, which is the higher education of the state Islamic, state higher education institutes. I'm told that as of the last year or so, they've actually changed it from agama, religion, to keagamaan, which is religiousness. And it's an important distinction because I say I don't study religion. I study religiousness. I don't study Islam, I study the Muslims and what they do for religion. And he's like, well, what's the difference? He's like, one is what they should do, and I leave that to the ulama, and what they actually do, and that's what I study. And so they've actually changed the name now. They focus more on keagamaan, or religiousness, rather than religion. And of course, it's always funny that the word used for agama Islam is Sanskrit word, agama. So it came from two things. One was a program for training religious teachers as well as training government religious functionaries. And so that was the primary sort of goal and output for many decades of these institutions, was teachers and government functionaries. Also to give pesantren graduates access to higher education. And one of the interesting things too was the original faculties were partially modeled after Al-Azhar in Cairo. I say partially modeled, or the men who designed it in the 1970s had been at Al-Azhar in the 1960s, and so they modeled it after Al-Azhar in the 1960s. But by the time the system was put into place, Al-Azhar had already added non-religious faculties and started allowing women to attend. One of the things I don't have on the slide too is understand one of the important figures in establishing this system is a figure known as Harun Nasution. And Harun is a self-described Neo Mutasa Light. So wanting to bring reason into kalam, into theology, in a way that hadn't really been part of Islam for a long time. And in the teaching of it is they examine and are willing to examine all the madhab. They're willing to examine the various heresies to see what value is there. And one of the interesting things when I was teaching at one in Sumatra, and at that point the campus was very run down, and there were Malaysian students there. And of course, almost universally, college campuses in Malaysia are beautiful. They're well-maintained gardens. And I'm like, what are you doing in this campus that has no road and just mud paths? And, a library with no card catalog, and what it, or, you know, it. And they said, because the religious institutions, I don't know if this is true, but they said it was because the religious colleges in Malaysia would not allow you to examine anything other than the sort of the officially government recognized Islam Hadari, a very program, and they were like, they wanted to be able to study Shia, to study all the madhab, and to see what value might be there, without necessarily making a religious commitment to, you know, the other perspectives that exist within Islam. And that's why they were, and again, from the beginning, I think that's one of the special things about these institutes. I know that at some point someone's going to ask, when did women start attending? And I don't know. I think from the beginning, but I'm not sure. Pardon?
It is from the beginning.
From the beginning, okay. I mean, I think you go there and you just assume it was from the beginning, and it's like, wait, was it? Yeah. So one of the things that was happening at the sort of in the zeros to 2000, 2010 was becoming of full-fledged universities. So the faculties that existed at the time were, well, some combination of one of the five of Usul-ud-Din, Sharia, Da'wah, Tarbiyah, and Adab. And places would have between 2 and 5 of those, with 3 or 4 being the most common. And of course, there's an upper limit to how many religious functionaries and religious teachers a society needs. It's like, okay, well, how many, you know, and so you'd have people graduating and not being employable. So there's a concern to have some expansion. There's also a concern that graduates from the secular school lack any sort of moral compass. We also know from the works like Bruce Lawrence and others that radical groups love to recruit STEM students because they know very little about religion, have strong religious thinking or feelings, and of course know how to do things like, you know, put chemicals together. They're not particularly interested in the people who know how to interpret fiqh texts because they lack any technical skills. So the vision is to become a fully developed university with an Islamic foundation. But there's problems. Well, first of all, the way they're structured is that each faculty has to be fully financially self-sufficient. And once they created to become a university, they had to add 2 general or 2 secular faculty. So technology was a common one, School of Medicine at some of them. And what would happen though is when the School of Medicine, say at Ciputat, wanted to teach Quranic ethics for doctors, they would hire their own teachers. And of course, they would tend to hire teachers from newer movements like Hizb ut-Tahrir and more sort of, if you will, Islamist organizations, rather than teachers that had been on the campus. And of course, when students are more interested in studying the social sciences or medicine than they are the religious topics, in a place that there is no general education, you had a decline in total number of students in the traditional faculties. See, at an American university, programs like anthropology and history can survive because while we may only have, in a school, at UNF we have 16,000 students, we may only have 100 anthropology majors. We teach thousands of students every semester from all over the university with sort of general education requirements. There's no such thing here, so that if the School of Medicine wants students to take religion, they'll hire their own teachers as opposed to sending them over. I mean, really, Quranic ethics for doctors, send them the Sharia. And if you need to, send a Sharia faculty member to a few training programs to learn the specifics for applying it to medicine. And so you get some resistance from faculty members because they're concerned of basically they're concerned of loss of income, they're concerned about, but they're also concerned that if the only place for the study of religion is in the religion faculties, that there'll be a loss of this sort of function of the institution. There are other models. The Muhammadiyah, the modernist organization, in their schools, they just say that they don't make each department be, or each faculty be economically self-sufficient, and so they subsidize the religion faculties with money from the other faculties. They're like, okay, well, we're going to take 20% of medicine's budget, and we're going to give it to the religion faculty because, well, it's important. But the state one is still set up in this way that makes it very competitive for students and for funding. And so, and I've talked to people, and I don't think actually that this model is going to be sustainable in the long run.
Which one, state or
The state model, as it currently is. I mean, they're trying to do things like come up with scholarships to encourage students to, do Usuluddin, and so that's how Usuluddin, at least in Yogyakarta, has students, is there's special scholarship programs, and I just, I've encouraged them to look at like a general education program, like if you're going to have a doctor take a religion class, have them take it from, this other faculty. The other thing that happens with that too is that the students in the secular fields tend to be drawn towards the Islamist movements. So, if you go to one of these campuses, it's not the students in Da'wah who are attracted to Hizb ut-Tahrir. It's the students in technology who are attracted to these movements. And they're a little perplexed. The faculty and the administration are perplexed about what do we do? I mean, we particularly those who are coming from the religion faculties, we absolutely oppose movements like Hizb ut-Tahrir and the idea of a Sharia state. But what do we do? And again, it's tied into the structural problem, or the structural. So some of the question is, where's the Islam? And so some of them try to Islamize the curriculum. There's an attempt to focus on a more Islamic environment, and some do both. And a lot of that, with the environment, is trying to return to some of the Byzantine roots. I've encouraged some of my friends in the Ministry of Religious Affairs to look at Christian universities in the West, and it's like no, but I don't necessarily look at the Christian part, but look at how they've managed to maintain a Christian identity and without any longer being just a seminary. And lots of them have done that. Some, greater success than others, but it's. So the conservatives, when they look at these and the changes that were going on in the early 2000s, they were concerned about a loss of Islamic authority and or authenticity, and starting to see the Middle East as somehow more authentic. And this is a modern discourse, because in the 19th century, most of the schools in Mecca and the Tariqah as well were headed by Southeast Asians, maybe not Indonesians, but people from Patani, from Thailand, and in the 19th century, the centers of Islamic education in the Middle East were led by Southeast Asians. But nowadays, some Southeast Asians start to look and see as the Middle East as being somehow more authentically Muslim. In the study of linguistics, we say that, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. The reason why the Middle East Islam is seen as more authentic is because there's an army and a navy and lots and lots and lots of petrodollars behind it. And they refer to it as a kind of Wahhabi colonialism. It's not my term, so don't get offended because it's not my term, it's their term. And the concern of a loss of Byzantine tradition, a loss of orthodoxy, a real fear of Orientalism, and they're also, why would you study religion in any place other than the Middle East? So you had in the 1980s and 1990s a lot of faculty going to the West to study, quote, religion or religious studies. And I'm actually a professor of anthropology and religious studies in Jacksonville, which is a very strongly Baptist town. It's hard to sometimes to get across to people that religious studies at a state university is not religious. So we've got the Islamic environment. The campus in Malang has created a campus Byzantine required for first-year students to live in. They also have to study Arabic very extensively and gain a certain level of Arabic. In Jakarta, it's trying to create a Byzantine environment without an institution. But they will work with the people who run, it's called course, basically, private student housing, and they have meetings and they encourage the families that run them to, report students that are doing things that they're not supposed to be doing, like having women in the room or having men in the room and things like this. And what's interesting too, and I don't have pictures of this with me, but is the non-religion faculties often have stricter dress codes for women. The burden falls on women. Then the religious faculties do. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay. So when we talk about returning to the Byzantine, I talked a little bit about that. And the part of it is these are boarding schools, and so a big part of it is moral education. And this picture down on the bottom corner of the young man doing his laundry is what they mean by moral education. And you're like, wait, he's doing laundry? And it's like, yes. And he could hire someone to do his laundry. But later in life, someone else will do his laundry. A servant, a wife. And if he has no idea what effort goes into doing laundry, he might be very rude to them. But if he knows what it takes to, and they have to do their own laundry, sweep, sometimes do their own cooking, if they know what's involved, then they will have compassion to those that will be doing it for them later. And they'll say, whether it's a wife or a servant, they will, not be arrogant. They know what it means to be, and my wife says, I think we should make it every man in the United States do his own laundry for, a good 10 years when he's growing up. And they pay very close attention to the behavior of what people do. And sometimes it's things that you might think are a little sort of silly, but the idea of private property within a Byzantine is a very tricky thing. If you own something and you're not using it at the moment and someone else could use it, and they can get it back in time for you when you need it again, you must lend it. There isn't, I mean, you know, my camera would disappear and come back with all the pictures shot and request to get double prints. 1990s, this is before digital. I said, okay, but you're gonna have to explain every picture to me. Come later find out that's an actual ethnographic research method. Called photo voice, you get people a camera and then just explain the pictures to me. But that's a big part of the moral education is not even just, it's not, yes, they go over what you should do, but a big part of it is just paying very close attention to behavior. So when they're talking about creating the pesantren on campus or a pesantren environment around the school without the pesantren, they're talking about creating systems to police students' behavior. You know, so that, you know, no dating, or if it is dating, it's what I think a very sort of 19th century courting, sitting on patios, not touching each other and talking. Which, you know, so, and really paying, you know, very close attention to these kinds of things. So they're trying to sort of either create or preserve the pesantren tradition on campus. Again, some of that is out of the education crisis of the 1990s in pesantren, where pesantren didn't know where the future leaders were going to come, and the expectation is they would come from these schools, the EIEN. But, you know, as things developed, you know, people would invite a graduate and they'd say, okay, well, will you lead the prayer, or will you recite Al-Fatiha, or will you, and they couldn't do it. And, you know, and it was hard for people to distinguish between a, you know, oh, well, you're a graduate from one of these schools, but you're in the technology department, so you don't need to be able to know how to do this, versus you're in one of the religion departments. And so some of that is what is going on with, we're trying to sort of establish the pesantren environment in the university. Some of that is back to the morality of a religious leader is needed rather than just the knowledge. But there's also, in one campus, they've actually set up certifications so that all graduates will be able to do some of the very basics of the gathering, from Muslim gatherings, you know, recite Al-Fatiha, lead the prayers, you know, real basic stuff that they would ask, they would just expect a graduate from one of these institutions to be able to do. And so, you know, they'd ask them, and if they couldn't do it, they're like, what's going on? May not be as relevant outside of Java. Indonesia has about 220 million people. 140 million of them live in an island roughly the size and shape of Kentucky. Canada has fewer people than the island of Java. And it may be less relevant outside of that context. They want to know where they want to go. So where to educate faculty, what country, and these were the big debates that were going on at the time when I was there. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, you've got seeking advanced degrees in the West, not necessarily in their teaching field. So you'll have someone who was in Tarbiyah or in Dahwa going and getting a PhD in anthropology or in psychology. And they would figure out in their teaching when they return sort of how to, you know, and obviously certain fields, Usul-ud-Din is where, well, okay. Comparative religion actually would wind up in one of two faculties, either Usul-ud-Din or Da'wah. And so that's where a lot of people would go off and do like the comparative study, comparative religion, and these things, and then figure out how to integrate like psychology into da'wah or psychology into tarbiyah, but it was not necessarily in their original teaching field, which nowadays they want them to sort of, you know, pursue it in the teaching field. So people start in the 80s. Actually, what would happen is you would graduate, and if you were some of the smartest kids, you would be actually taken on by the university to be part of the teaching staff with just your bachelor's degree. And you would spend a number of years being a very dutiful helper, and then you might be rewarded with given the opportunity to go get a master's degree. And then you'd come back and you would teach your own classes, and if you were very dutiful and supportive, you would get rewarded by being sent off to get a PhD. And the funding, you know, Ford Foundation, Fulbright, similar programs from Australia, Netherlands, Germany. There was some criticism in the 1990s that there was too much going into the West, and he said, well, that's where the money is. If you don't want us to send to the West, get money from the East or come up with our own money. Does studying in the West really yield a more liberal perspective? That was the concern, is that people who studied in the West would have a more liberal perspective. And from off campus, yes, in part. The big one that would, so what was the big debate that was going on in the early 2000s was whether or not, were people accusing some of these professors of being murtad. And the most common reason for someone being an apostate was basically saying that women could be just as smart as men and have the same rights, and you know, it's kind of a strange thing. But the on-campus view is that not in ritual practice, perhaps in thoughts and ideas. The concern is, you know, they start using social science statistics rather than the Quran to justify something. Like, you know, women are smart. Here's the statistics. I'm like, well, the Quran. And again, there are other people who are working really hard at examining both men and women, and they've written lots of books about misogynistic hadith and how hadith are, that it's not really necessarily that the hadith are misogynistic, but the readings of the hadith are, and they are misogynistic because of the way they're read, because of the selecting these and not these. And there are people who work on this. And so, yeah, they from some of the more extreme ends of people. What's interesting is the extreme critics of these institutions are not only Islamists and want a Sharia state, they're also people who were not selected into the career path of becoming faculty there. I mean, is that coincidental? I don't know, but it's sort of like, he's very critical of it, but he also wanted to be a professor there and couldn't be a professor there. So is it personal vendetta? I don't know. It's in my mind, it's relevant that he's a failed academic, but may not be the main thing. Are Middle East any better? Graduates in the Middle East any better? And first of all, it's hard for someone like me to access these faculty. It's very easy for me to go talk to faculty who've studied anthropology and religious studies in the West. They're happy to see me. I'm a rock star. Those who don't think the way they do don't tend to talk to me. Appointments are made and they don't show up, and repeatedly. It's inshallah becomes a code for no. Just in a practical sense. But let's say sometimes the Middle Eastern educated faculty can be more liberal on doctrinal matters. That the liberalism, really, it's so the Western are more liberal on social matters, of big, just gender parity, coexisting with other religions, these kinds of things, were on actual sort of doctrinal matters of like, what is the nature of God. The Middle Eastern ones, I'm told, can be a little bit more out there, which makes, at least understanding why the Western ones aren't out there on the theology makes sense, because that's not how we teach religious studies in the West. Okay, I've hit a lot of this. I felt that was a lot more disorganized than I had hoped it would be, but I welcome sort of any questions.